Good evening, everyone. Just to remind everybody, we will be doing tonight Parashat Chukat. Okay, in the diaspora, you're doing Parashat Korach. And excuse me for 1 second. I have to turn off my cell phone. So we are doing Parashat Chukat. It's only next week that the diaspora will be synchronized with the land of Israel. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to look at the beginning of our Parsha, which has the laws of the Red Heifer, and to actually see that as being a springboard for understanding the whole Parsha. And in fact, I want to do something now which I've done throughout the book of Bamidbar, and that is to say that the whole law of the Red Heifer is out of place in our Parsha. And what do I mean by that? The Red Heifer exists in order to be able to purify someone who has come in contact with a dead body. The logical place for this to appear is actually after the tabernacle is established. In fact, according to rabbinic tradition, the laws of the Red Heifer were given to the Jewish people the day after the tabernacle was established. And that would be the logical place, because if I have a tabernacle which requires the people to be in a state of ritual purity, and one way of becoming impure is contact with a dead body, so then this is something which is essential for the people to know at the very outset. But even if somebody wanted to make the case, for whatever reason, that it shouldn't appear in the beginning of Vayikra, but at the very least, when the camp is set up, in the beginning of Bamidbar, when we're told how all those who are impure as a result of contact with a dead body should be sent outside the camp, then it would make sense that at that point that we should perhaps be told the laws of the Red Heifer. Worst case, in chapter 9 in Bamidbar, there are people who are ritually impure because they came in contact with a dead body and cannot bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, and there we're told the laws of Pesach Sheni. So what I'm just trying to show you is, on many, many levels, it is not the appropriate spot to be telling us the laws of the Red Heifer right here. And as I've done in other cases in the book of Bamidbar, my feeling is that the reason why we've put something out of place is because it's very important thematically. So before I get to why the Red Heifer is important thematically to this Parsha, I would like to just examine the laws of the Red Heifer. And in particular, I want to focus on the title of the Parsha, Chukat. The laws of the Red Heifer are preceded. Now we are in chapter 19 in Bamidbar, verse 2. It says, Zot Chukat HaTorah, which is generally translated as, this is the statute of the Torah. What is a chok? So the simple meaning is, a chok is something which is engraved, which is embedded. Today in modern Hebrew, the word chukah is the term for constitution, which would therefore mean that a chok is something which is a kind of fundamental principle, something which is what we would call the bedrock of our society. That's according to the simple meaning. The rabbis, and Rashi quotes this, have for the moment, different understanding of the word chok, And the idea of a chok is something which defies our reason, which we just can't begin to fathom, which we don't understand. And I'd like to sharpen that by saying, it's not just that it's hard to understand it. The reason why it's hard to understand it is because it's irrational. And what I'd like to begin with is to see, in fact, the contradictions that appear in this law of the red heifer, which make it a chok. So let's begin with the following. The first thing is the red heifer is supposed to purify someone who's impure, who has come in contact with a dead body. Now, that fact is then contradicted by another fact which we see throughout the section. And that is all the people who are involved with the production of the ashes of the red heifer become ritually impure. So that if I, for example, look at chapter 19, verse 7, it says, V'chibes begadav hakohen, that the Kohen who is involved in the sacrifice and the burning of the red heifer, in the sprinkling of the blood, has to now wash his garments. He has to bathe himself, which is a code word for ritual immersion. And then it says, and then only subsequently can he come into the camp. He is impure until the evening. And then if you look at verse 8, and the one who burns it needs to wash his clothing and to bathe himself and is impure until the evening. And if you scroll down a little bit to verse 21, it says, and this shall be an everlasting statute. Whoever sprinkles, right, the solution of the ashes of the red heifer has to wash their clothes. Whoever touches it is impure until the evening. So I think I've made my point that what I have here is a problematic phenomenon. And that is the red heifer, whose whole purpose is to purify those who are impure by virtue of contact with a dead body, actually makes impure all those who are pure, who are involved in the production of the ashes. So what is it? Is it something which makes you pure, or is it something which makes you impure? How can I have the same thing that makes someone pure and makes someone else impure? One example of a problem. Second example, if you look at the beginning, when it describes the beginning of the process of making the ashes, it says the following in chapter 19, verse 2. Moshe and Aaron are supposed to speak to the Jewish people and tell them to take a red heifer. The red heifer is supposed to be tmimah. It has to be complete. And the rabbis understand complete in the sense of completely red. Asher ein ba mum, it has no blemish. And this is why the rabbis say complete means completely red, because otherwise ein bo mum, ein bo blemish is superfluous. If complete means without blemish, why say it twice? And then they go on to say, give it to Elazar the Kohen, and he's supposed to take it outside the camp, slaughter it, takes the blood, sprinkles it 7 times towards the tent of meeting, burns it. And not only does he burn he burns it in total. The skin, the flesh, everything is burned. So what I would like to point out is the whole procedure which I've just read is essentially what we would call a sacrificial procedure. It's done by the priest. We have slaughtering. We have sprinkling of blood, which is done towards the tent of meeting. We have the burning of the animal, totally burned. It sounds like an offering, with one problem. Where is all this happening? It's happening outside the camp. Okay, and according to rabbinic tradition, when the Jewish people were in the land of Israel, this would actually be done on the Mount of Olives, facing the Temple Mount. And there's actually a particular spot which has been located, or has been, how should I put it, estimated by various archaeologists, because it has to be done at the spot where you have a clear view into the temple from that spot. So I have a problem. My problem is, since when do I do sacrificial services outside the temple? And in fact, if you go to Leviticus chapter 17, you'll see that this is actually something which is explicitly prohibited. In fact, the rabbis note, we do have one example of a sacrifice which is actually brought outside the temple, and that is the scapegoat on Yom Kippur. And interesting enough, the scapegoat is also seen as being an anomaly, as being a chok, because it goes completely against the rules of what we normally do. Except that in the case of the scapegoat, what you do is you push it off a cliff in the middle of the Judean desert. In this case, what you're doing is going through all the different steps of a sacrificial rite. You slaughter the animal, you sprinkle the blood, you then burn it. So wait a second, what are we doing over here? Why are we now bringing a sacrifice outside the temple? Now, I just want to point out, oh, by the way, I should also point out, the very fact that we require this to be unblemished is also a key requirement of a sacrifice. Now, what I would also like to point out over here, excuse me, is that the para aduma is referred to as a chatat. If you look at verse 9 at the end, it says that a pure man shall gather all the ashes, place them outside the camp, and this shall be as something to be guarded. Lemeinidah, which I'll come back to later, chatati. This is a chatat. Now, chatat, we know, is a sin offering. Now, for those of you who know Rashi, and I'm sure there are those in the crowd, and everybody always likes to make a comment. So Rashi says that in this context, the word chatat is related to the Hebrew word chitui, lechatot in modern Hebrew, and evidently in rabbinic Hebrew as well. And one might say, based on this biblical Hebrew, means to disinfect. So he says that's exactly why we call it a chatat, because its purpose is to make pure those who become impure. It's as if we are now disinfecting them of their impurity. But I do want to point out that if you were to check this out throughout the Torah, you will see that nowhere else in the Torah is the word chatat used as a disinfectant. Whenever the word chatat appears in the Torah, it is generally associated with a sin offering. So if for the moment you'll indulge me and say that, so maybe there's a certain element of this being a sacrifice. So here again, I come to a problem, which is, why are we offering this sacrifice outside the temple, which goes completely against our rules? Now let me bring up another factor. When we sprinkle the ashes on somebody who is ritually impure in order to make them pure, we're told the following. This is verse 17, chapter 19, 17. It says, and you shall take to the person who's impure from the ashes of the chatat, and what you should do is, excuse me, I lost my place. You should put upon it living water in a utensil. And in fact, the halacha is that the ashes of the paraduma must be mixed together with living water which the rabbis understand as water from a spring, in a utensil. After you mix the ashes together with the living water, you then take a hyssop, an azov, and you sprinkle it into the mixture, and then you sprinkle it on the person who is ritually impure on the third day of his impurity, on the seventh day. And this is the critical element in the process of his purification. So now, what are we doing over here? We're taking ashes from something that was burned, and burned was destroyed, is dead, and mixing it together with what is called living water. So essentially, we're taking two contradictory elements as part of this purification process. By the way, earlier, as part of the process, we also took a erez and an azov, okay, which we combine and we put it into the into the heifer when it's burning. So it's very interesting that there seems to be this combination of, again, contradictory elements which we are bringing up over here. Now, the other thing which I'll also point out is that generally in purification processes, you go to the mikveh, or if not to a mikveh, you go to a spring, but you cannot purify yourself by immersing yourself in what is called a utensil. You couldn't go into a bathtub that you filled up and then just dunk and become ritually pure. So that using a utensil disqualifies someone from ritual immersion. And here we are specifically using a utensil as part of that process. So what I've tried to show you in a number of different ways is that what's happening in the case of the red heifer is that we're doing all kinds of things which are either self-contradictory or contradict other rules which we have in other places. And on the basis of that, this is my understanding why the rabbis see the red heifer as being the classic example of a chok, which according to the rabbinic understanding is something which defies our logic. And it defies our logic because, as I said, it's irrational. So today I'm going to try to get some sort of insight into the red heifer, which is not going to give you the answer of the red heifer, but maybe will at least, explain what we just did. Now, I mentioned to you that the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, are combined with living water, and the purpose is to purify someone who has come in contact with a dead body. It's worth noting that ritual impurity as a result of contact with a dead body is the most intense form, the highest form of ritual impurity. In the language of the rabbis, avi avot hatuma, a dead body, is the granddaddy, so to speak, of ritual impurity. It's the source of all ritual impurity. In every other case of ritual impurity, somebody goes to the mikveh and then they become pure. In some cases, there might be a need to also immerse your clothing. In some cases, you may have to wait for a certain period. This is the only case where in order to become pure, it's not enough to go to a mikveh. You also have to have the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on you. And I just want to note, which is the reason why today everyone is considered to be in a state of ritual impurity, because the assumption is that everyone in the course of their life has somehow had contact with a dead body. If you went to a cemetery, if you were in a hospital, right, which has a morgue, without going into the details, you have now become ritual impure because of contact with a dead body. And if you touched anybody who had that experience, you will become ritually impure as a result, although that ritual impurity could be removed by just going to the mikveh. But in any case, the red heifer is critical for someone who's come in contact with a dead body. Now, again, I just want to point out, going back to how I began the shiur, in chapters 12 to 15 in the book of Vayikra, we're given a whole series of laws that have to do with ritual impurity. Ritual impurity that's a result of someone's body, connected with someone's body. It would have been logical to introduce those laws with our section about the red heifer. Logically, let's start, if we're giving you laws of ritual impurity, start with, as I said, the granddaddy of ritual impurity, and then go on to the next level of ritual impurity, which are essentially an extension of the first. So now I would like to at least begin understanding the red heifer. And to do so, I would like to take a few moments to talk about the concept of ritual impurity, and specifically ritual impurity associated with contact with a dead body. And here I would urge you, for those of you who have, to read Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, to read his commentary on this section. And essentially what I'll do is summarize it. And what he says is as follows. The first thing is that ritual impurity, right, which some people might have the tendency to connect with, has nothing to do with disease, has nothing to do with infection, okay? Dead bodies have all kinds of germs, right? You'll get infected by them. No. Rabbi Hirsch essentially says that ritual impurity has to do with the state of the soul. And that is impacted when one has contact with a dead body. And what do I mean by that? When a person has contact with a dead body, there are actually two major theological issues which come up. Maybe I'd say three, but let's say two are connected. The first question is there really a God in the world? If there's a God in the world, how could God allow this to happen? And I'm sure many people have had the experience, unfortunately, when you experience death of a close relative, or maybe even hear of certain situations, accidents. So there's a certain gut reaction How could God let that happen? Maybe there is no God in the world. And the second issue is, in the beginning of Genesis, we speak about how people are created in the image of God. Where is the image of God when you look at a dead body? There is no sense of a divine image in a dead body. And in fact, this is how we understand a dead body. A dead body is where the neshama, the soul, has left. That which makes you godly has departed, so that all I'm left with is, you might say, a piece of flesh. And that's connected to another question, which is, what's the purpose of life? We speak about how we are made in the image of God, and that makes our lives meaningful and purposeful. But then when I see someone who's dead, I say to myself, but if everybody's going to die, then what's the point of everything that we're doing when we're alive? Which therefore means that contact with a dead body raises a fundamental question as to belief in God, whether God actually intervenes in what happens in the world, belief in the meaning of human existence, the value of human existence. And all of those questions create a state of ritual impurity. In fact, what I'd like to say now is, if someone has contact with death and doesn't have those questions, you should have those questions. Which means the idea that you're impure is not because you had the questions. It's because you should have those questions, because the situation begs those questions. And therefore, the whole period of impurity is a period of introspection. And essentially, it's a period where one has to perhaps reaffirm their belief in God, their belief in human existence, their belief in purposeful existence, despite the fact that one dies, but life is meaningful. I'd like to just point out that Rabbi Soloveitchik actually said something very similar related to the laws of mourning. When somebody loses a close relative and you're in a period of mourning, he sees that the period of mourning is actually a period of introspection. And again, I'm sure that many people have had this question. If it's been someone who's very close to you who's died, depending on the circumstances, people become angry with God. How could God allow that? How could God do that? So people very much wrestle with God. Rabbi Soloveitchik actually says another thing, which is very interesting, that he says that very often it's only when you're sitting shiva for someone that you begin to realize the sense of loss of that individual, or to phrase it differently, how valuable that individual was, how important that individual, what that individual meant to you. Which means very often we take relationships for granted, and we only value them when we no longer have them. And so again, it becomes it's a period of introspection, where one has to somehow reaffirm their faith in God, but reaffirm their faith in human existence. And what I would like to say right now is that the riddle of the red heifer, or what I would call the chok of the red heifer, essentially mirrors the riddle of life. And essentially what the red heifer is saying to us is, Life, human existence, defies our understanding. Life is filled with contradictions. And this is something that we have to learn to grapple with. And in the case of the red heifer, when someone has come in contact with death which is devastating, the point of the red heifer is to say to that individual, yes, death is devastating. Death is horrible. Death goes against everything that I believe in. And yet, despite that, I need to affirm life. And that is, in a certain sense, our human predicament. How do we acknowledge death? Not ignore it, acknowledge it, feel it, and yet at the same time, be able to affirm life. How do we now not go to either extreme, to be indifferent to death, or to go to the other extreme, to allow death to overwhelm us, incapacitate us? But maybe there's a third path. The third path being to acknowledge death, the horror of death, and yet at the same time, to affirm the importance of life. I think I mentioned on other occasions, I am the child of a Holocaust survivor, and many Holocaust survivors were traumatized, which we can understand, and found it extremely difficult to go on with their lives. For those of us who live in Israel, how many people do we know who had family members who were killed in terror attacks, soldiers who were killed in the line of duty, who were totally devastated by the loss of their relatives? And yet at the same time, we also know people, many people, who will say that they live every day with the pain of their loss, but they need to go on with their lives. They must go on with their lives. As long as they have their lives, they have a gift which they need to maximize to its fullest. That is the riddle of the red heifer. How can we live when we experience death? How do we go on living? How are we able to live as human beings who want to feel that they are in control of what's around them, with the realization that things are completely beyond our control? I am sure that there are some people who have that feeling now with the coronavirus, right? That here we are, and at least everybody that I've heard, the experts, all the experts say, we have no idea about what's going on with this virus. And as much as we learn about it, we always discover something new. And one day we'll tell you to do this, and another day we'll tell you to do something else. Is there going to be a second outbreak of it? How long will it last? What will be? We don't know. For many people, that's terrifying. That's incapacitating. By the way, that's also the purpose of terror. When you have terror attacks, should I go outside my house? Should I go on a bus? Should I go on an airplane? Who knows what can happen? That's the whole point, right? To have something, the fear of the unknown, which incapacitates you. Or at what point is that somebody simply accepts the fact, I don't know, but let me deal with what I do know. I don't know, but let me now at least try to make the most of the situation I find myself in. Now, this point becomes central to the whole parsha. And before I go on to how this is relevant to the parsha, I just want to point out that in Parshat Chukat, 40 years of the Jewish people wandering in a desert is crossed in one verse. Again, according to the rabbinic understanding, the beginning of the parsha, which speaks about the red heifer, were the laws given to the Jewish people a year after they left Egypt, after they established the tabernacle. If you look at the beginning of chapter 20, sorry, I just touched my computer. If you look at the beginning of chapter 20, it says, the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the desert of Tzin in the first month. And according to the rabbinic understanding, this is the first month of the 40th year, which means that in our parsha, we start off with a law which was given to them a year after they left Egypt. And then all of a sudden we transition 40 years later. By the way, if you go back to Parshat Korach, those of you in the diaspora, that's your parsha this week. Parshat Korach is happening in the second year, right? A year after the Jewish people left Egypt, which means from Parshat Korach to our parsha, chapter 20, 40 years or 39 years have gone by, and we know absolutely nothing what happened during that period of time. Fascinating. We have a lot of stories about what happened as soon as the Jewish people left Egypt, what happened the following year. But what happened during those 38 years that they were wandering? Nothing. And then all of a sudden, we start skipping that whole, what we might say, foundational period. And then all of a sudden go into what happens in that last year. I'd be really curious to know what happened all that other time. But we don't have any record. Now, what are we told about? So let's look at the beginning of, now, by the way, on what do the rabbis base this? They base it on a simple phrase where it says the Jewish people come, the whole congregation, the whole Eidah, Kol Adatis, in chapter 20, verse 1. Well, the rabbis say, what does it mean, the whole congregation? So they say, the whole new congregation, as a way of saying, in Parshat Shlach, when they sent out the spies, God said, the whole generation who left Egypt will die out in the desert. A new generation will grow up. We are now in chapter 20 dealing with the whole new congregation that's grown up in the desert. Chapter 20 is happening after that old generation died out in the desert. What's the first thing that we're told about? So I got to get used to this like a rhetorical question because everybody's on mute. What's the first thing that we're told about? The death of Miriam. Miriam dies, she's buried there. I'm sure that there are people out there who are, especially people who are, I'm not saying this pejoratively, so people should, the feminists, right? Who, here Miriam dies and nobody says a word about her. Like, you know, when Aaron dies, we have a whole thing. When Moshe dies, we have, but with Miriam, so she died, she's buried. We don't say anything about her. And the truth is, it is very disturbing because why is it that Miriam is dying? Now you'll say, well, of course. What do you mean, why is she dying? She's an old lady, right? In other words, she must be about 125 at this point, you know, so Of course not. Now, by the way, I just want to point out, the only ones who actually, the generation that died in the desert, were actually only the men above the age of 20. According to the rabbinic understanding, there was no decree on the women who were above that age, which means, in theory at least, there could have been quite a few elderly women who came into the land of Israel, including Miriam. So here we have something which, at least is a question. It would be interesting to know, why did she die? What did she die from? Especially when we see the continuation. Now, by the way, when you look at the continuation, all of a sudden Miriam dies. There's no water. Okay? And on that basis, the rabbis actually say there were 3 gifts which were given to the Jewish people in honor of their 3 leaders. One of the gifts was water. And as some of you may be familiar with, the well of Miriam. The fact that the Jewish people had a water system that accompanied them throughout their journeys in the desert, that was seen as being in the merit of Miriam. And to a certain extent, the rabbis see that from this verse. Because when Miriam dies, no water. What's the connection? Why all of a sudden should there be no water? Well, they only had water because it was in the merit of Miriam. So I just want to point out, so again, it kind of begs the question. So if the Jewish people are getting water the whole time in the merit of Miriam, so why is she dying? And then why do we need to then create that problem for them? But what to me is even more significant is, in the aftermath of the lack of water, then all of a sudden there's an incident where the Jewish people are now complaining. And then all of a sudden you have Moshe and Aaron being instructed to take their staffs and to talk to the rock. And they didn't talk, they hit the rock. And then what's even more important to me is, if you look subsequently, God says to them, this is chapter 20, in verse 12, where God says, because you didn't have faith in me to sanctify me before the eyes of the Jewish people, you will not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. Now, I actually was debating what I was going to do today, but then I remembered that last year I did a podcast, and I welcome you to listen to it on our website, about what was the sin of Moses and Aaron that warranted that God should say that you did not have faith in me, and you will not, as a result, bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And in fact, I have a source sheet which I attached. The Abarbanel, for example, lists 12 reasons of what was their sin. And I just want to point out, very unclear what it is that they did. But now I want to even say something which is more significant. Whichever reason that you give, it's very easy, and I don't say this facetiously, I'm saying this seriously. Okay, Lori, I'll give you a chance to say something, okay? It's very easy to say the punishment is far in excess of the crime. Or to put it in simple language, it's not fair. Whatever they did over here, for that, they should not be allowed to enter the land of Israel? Where is the justice? What kind of a God is this who's being so unfair to Moshe and Aaron? And by the way, I'll just say this now, who's also adamantly rigid about it. If you look later on in Deuteronomy, Moshe describes how he pleaded with God to give him a chance, let him go in, and God absolutely refused to allow him to go into the land of Israel. So what I would like to say is, on a certain level, God's punishing Moshe and Aaron, telling them that they will not be allowed to enter the land of Israel, that's a chok. That's something which in the end, we don't fully understand. In the grand scheme of things, okay, yes, maybe you could give some type of explanation, but at some point, it's something that's very, very troublesome. That's a chok. And I would also like to point out what's even more of a chok is that God then expects Moshe to continue leading the Jewish people until his death. Which means somebody could have come along and said, you know what? I messed up. You won't let me come into the land of Israel. So let's stop now. Let Joshua take over right now. And yet what God is in effect saying to Moshe is, despite the fact that you will not enter the land of Israel, you have to continue being the leader of the Jewish people until the day you die. That's a chok. That means Moshe has to live with the fact that the end goal of everything that he's been working towards, he will not achieve. And yet, despite that, he has to do everything leading up to that. He has to be able to affirm his leadership, which in effect is the purpose of his life, to the very end, despite the fact that he is being deprived of the cherry, of the icing on the cake. He will not bring them into the land of Israel. This is a chok. Okay, Lori, I saw that somebody said you had your hand up. So here, entertain a question or comment. Simon, is there a way of unmuting her?
Oh, there. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So when you were talking about punishments, I have a question. So if Aaron lied about who made the golden calf and he's not punished, but Miriam tells the truth about who Moses was seeing and she's punished with the tsaros. Abraham lies about who his wife is and he's not punished. Others lie. So where is the morality and the ethicalness and the honesty when some people are punished and others are not?
Okay, you just proved my point. Okay, now, the truth is that I could actually go into giving you explanations for each of those situations. Okay, but that would actually take us beyond the scope. But if you want me to do after the shir, so I'll hang around for a few minutes and we can take each individual case. But what I want to point out is what you're saying over here is exactly the point. That when I look at a whole bunch of different situations, it seems that things are unfair. And that raises a lot of issues for me. And that's why I especially said it over here with Moshe, okay? Because there does seem to be something. And again, I want to maybe even make the point even stronger, okay? Here is Moshe, who not only took the Jewish people out of Israel, not only had them cross the Red Sea, not only had them at Mount Sinai receive the Torah, enter into a covenantal relationship with God, but 40 years, day in, day out, had to provide for them with all of the needs which they had to literally shepherd them throughout their journey in the desert. I can't even begin to imagine the tremendous burden, right, the tremendous responsibility that placed upon him. And then because of what would seem to be one slip up, he can't then bring them into the land of Israel. So To me, that heightens the question. It just seems it's not fair. So what you're bringing up, I think, is just reinforcing it. Well, if I look at this case and I look at that case, and yet it seems to be over here, God is willing to be kind of, how should I put it, to be understanding. Over here, God is being really tough. Well, why is God so tough over there? Why is God understanding over here? Why is God giving them a second chance over there? Why is God not at all being responsive? Maybe at a certain point, that's the point of a chok, that maybe we don't understand. Now, by the way, I just want to point out, which is how at least I understand it, that maybe the point of a chok is that, in other words, if theoretically we saw the whole picture, we'd understand. But we don't see the whole picture. And maybe we always only see a fraction. Yes, Dennis.
Rabbi, your last comment is profound. And I would suggest there's a counter narrative that does provide meta rationality or a reason that we can grasp and that actually can touch eternity. And that is, if we can live with the uncertainty of death and how we die bespeaks how we live, then it's not contradictory, and the hope is profoundly insightful. If we think that Moses was given the gift that no other human had of seeing into the future when he's on top of the mountain, unlike all other Jews, no one is able to see far into the future and back. As we know, we only understand reality in retrospect when we look back. So for Moses, the gift is he's able to see forward. He's able to see that his transcendence through Joshua and through this incredible wearing down and burden was a gift that no other human and prophet has been granted. And while that may seem insufficient consideration or compensation, I would suggest that it's profoundly so. And remember too that the hoch and the death of the people are still allowed to live. They're still provided with manna. They're just not given the burdens because they can't tolerate the burdens of liberty and personal responsibility. Does that make any sense?
Yes, Dennis, thank you very much. I just wanted, but I want to just pick up because my time is running out. So I just want to pick up. No, it's fine. I just want to pick up on the last thing that you said. Okay, and that I think becomes also very important for us. If I look at the story of Moshe, right, when Moshe hits the rock, and this is a new generation, if you actually look at what happens in that story, and then subsequently there's a second story, okay, which is actually in chapter 21, verses 5 through 7, okay? Two incidents which involve this new generation where there's a lack of water. How do they respond? And if you look at how the Jewish people speak, they're actually very obnoxious. In other words, why didn't we die in the desert? Why are we now being brought over here and we haven't been brought into the land? Okay, first story. And the second story, all of a sudden they start complaining against the manna. Why did God take us? Or they say to Moshe, why did you take us out of Egypt? Now, interestingly, at a certain point, and at least according to Rabbi Semsel Raphael Hirsch, he says that part of the reason why Moshe got frustrated, extremely frustrated, right, in the story with the lack of water, was that to a great extent it was deja vu. Moshe says, here I am. We just brought up a new generation in the desert, and they're acting exactly the same way as the old generation. So what have we accomplished? It's so frustrating. What have we accomplished in 40 years? And then I have a second story, which is even more obnoxious. When they speak about the manna as being this bread which is just ruining them. And then what you find is that God sends forth these snakes, and then all of a sudden I have something which actually didn't happen before, or at least in real time. All of a sudden, if you look at this, is chapter 21, verse 7. The people come to Moshe and they say, we have sinned. We spoke against God and you. Pray to God. Get rid of the snakes. Which means that the people, so Dennis, in terms of the people are taking responsibility. They're acknowledging the fact that they sinned. They're acknowledging that they sinned against God and Moshe. And they're saying to Moshe, which is what they should have said from the beginning, Moshe, pray to God. We're in a bad situation. And Moshe does. Which means that even if this generation starts out on the wrong foot, but at a certain point, right, they get it right. Now, I just want to point out one last thing. At the end of the Parsha, the Jewish people begin their ascent to the land of Israel, and they begin going up the eastern side of the Jordan River. And not only do they begin going up, but at the very end of the Parsha, they actually engage in battle with two kings, Sichon and Og, which in effect begins the conquest of the land of Israel. Which therefore means which is very interesting, is that although Moshe does not bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel, he does begin the process of what might be seen as the not only conquest, but even the taking possession of what will eventually also become part of the extended land of Israel, which is the eastern side of the Jordan. And that to a great extent, what Moshe is doing at the end of our Parsha is setting the stage. It's the foreshadowing of what will happen later on with Joshua on the western side of the Jordan. So that what I want to just end with is to show you how our Parsha essentially is talking about what I would call the chok of life. And that there are many things which seem to be contradictory in our lives. And the challenge is how are we able to somehow live with those contradictions? And in terms of what you brought up, Dennis, which I think becomes also extremely important you said not to look back maybe, but to look forward, okay? And I would say yes, to look forward, but by looking forward also be appreciating and experiencing the present, every moment of the present. And to be able to say to oneself that as long as I am alive, I need to make the most of my life.
Amen.
As long as I'm alive, I will not understand everything which is happening. But when I find myself in all kinds of situations, how am I able to somehow derive the maximum from that? Sometimes, as you said, Dennis, people may be able in retrospect to look back on their lives and to see how maybe certain things actually were really very positive, even though at the time they seemed very negative, because they enabled them to get to a certain point. Sometimes not. And sometimes it might be that people may simply say to themselves, even though on a certain level I wasn't able to reach a certain point in terms of my self-actualization, but at the same time, I was also able to lay the foundations for future generations and to simply see myself as being part of a chain, and that I am simply continuing what was before me and maybe laying the foundations for what will be after me, and to be able to somehow maybe look into the future to what will be later on. So what I would like to say, my time is up. When we began these shiurim this is first of all my last Parashat Hashavuah, until hopefully to be renewed at the end of the summer. when we first began this was actually an experiment. We didn't know what would happen, who would come. Okay, my feeling is that it's been somewhat successful, but I just would like to point out we will be sending out, asking everybody who participated to fill out a questionnaire to, an evaluation, so that with God's help, when we continue after the summer, okay, we'll be able to make this bigger and better. I am certainly a firm believer in the potential of online learning, which I would like to continue later in the coming years. For those, I think I mentioned to you, or people have mentioned, officially I am retiring from Pardes this summer. Next week we are having an online seminar which I am organizing, and essentially when we finish the seminar I will be, whether not officially retired, but practically retired from being a full-time teacher, administrator in Pardes. I am hoping to continue beyond that, and I am hoping that I will be able to continue learning with all of you. It has been a pleasure these past few weeks, and as I said in the shir, at one time in my life I had this vision that I would continue in Pardes forever, and especially with Pardes about to build a new building. That was kind of something I was really looking forward to. But for a variety of reasons, evidently that is not going to happen. But like Moshe Rabbeinu, on a completely different level, I have to be happy with my stay at Pardes, which actually was more than 40 years, which is 43 years. And to feel that whatever I did certainly helped to lay the foundations of Pardes in the future, and to be very hopeful and foresightful that Pardes will just continue to grow and expand in its new facilities, and maybe I'll still continue to have some part in that. So I thank you all very much.
Toda rabah.
For those
Toda rabah.
who would like to stay for a few
Toda
minutes.
rabah.
So,
Baruch Hashem.
okay.
Rabbi.
Yes,
The best ever. The best ever.
thank you.
You've been fantastic, Rabbi.
Please continue. Please continue.
This has been enormously successful, in my opinion.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Mayor. Thank you,
It's been-
Sharon.
We learned so much. What a good
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
This has been so wonderful. I'm so disappointed it's not continuing.
Marvelous.
Well, hopefully we will continue after the summer, but it may be in a slightly different format. We'll see.
Rabbi, I hope you
This
feel
has
all
been
better.
amazing. Is there a moment for comment?
Yes, there's a moment for comments, Bracha.
Um,
I can count on you.
I was just wondering whether maybe Moshe was in some way being given a gift of completion, because taking Eretz Yisrael out of the ballpark, so he was great at connecting with Hashem, he was great at connecting with Eretz Yisrael. Where he was a little weaker was in connection with the people. If you take Eretz Yisrael out of the ballpark, then he gets refocused on being able to get in really good with the people.
So I'd like to say something about that, because sometimes I actually got into trouble with somebody when I thought about the story about Moshe. I'll just mention one comment, okay, about the Rambam in a commentary of his on Pirkei Avot. It's called Shmoneh Prakim. Actually talks about the problem. He talks about different qualities, virtues that people should have. So he speaks about the problematic of becoming angry. In other words, how getting angry is a terrible quality. And then the Rambam wants to make the case that was Moshe's sin over here, that he got angry. But what he says is that it's not just that Moshe got angry, but by getting angry, this was a desecration of God's name. That's the Rambam says this. I got into trouble when I once gave a drasha in my shul about this. because somebody got very upset with me. How could you possibly say that about Moshe? That Moshe desecrated God's name. Okay, so, but Rambam says it. But by the way, I just said it not to badmouth Moshe, but to show how it's so easy to do a desecration of God's name. But the point, though, why am I bringing this up? Because I mentioned to you that in our Parsha, it doesn't speak at all what happened for 38 years when they were in the desert. So, yes, we can see in our Parsha that we had this incident in where, yes, maybe Moshe got angry, or Moshe did this, or Moshe did that. But what about 38 years of day-to-day dealing with all the needs of the people?
Right.
And I'd say even more than that, of educating the people. And not only that, but if in fact, which is the case, this generation ultimately succeeded in coming into the land of Israel, conquering it, taking possession of it, it's not just because of Joshua, but at its core, it's because of Moshe, who essentially brought up that generation to be who they were. And so therefore, I think, it's very, very important to be able, to see that larger picture and to be able to say that, in other words, that, what did Moshe do in terms of raising the people? And that we don't see. In other words, what is this analogous to? It's analogous to what you see on the news when they have, what do they report? They report all the problems. You rarely see all the good things that are happening, and especially the good things which are happening over an extended period of time. So I think that we have to also put that into perspective and to,
Good point.
to come back to what you said. So I don't think it was that Moshe was not focusing on the people previously. If anything, I think there were 38 years where his complete focus was on the people and complete focus as an educator. And I think, which is also the case, that if you then go into the book of Dvarim, essentially Dvarim is Moshe's final legacy to the Jewish people, okay? Which are all the instructions which he gives to them, which is taking everything that he spent 38 years doing and now handing over to them, right, which they will take with them when they come into the land of Israel. So I would see Dvarim essentially in terms of what you wanted to bring up, bracha. That in other words, it's focused.
Brilliantly said.
And this is, Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha. This is the morasha of Moshe, the Torah that he teaches us. So that's my take on it. By the way, I also want to say on that note, since I'm not going to be doing this in the summer, that it's fascinating that Moshe, at the beginning of his career, says that I am not a man of words. And then I have a whole book, which are the words of Moshe, which is a lot of talking for somebody who doesn't know how to talk.
That's good.
So the man who is not a teacher for all generations becomes a teacher for all generations.
Absolutely, yes. Cindy, you say something.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. More than you can imagine, 15 years. So when I look at the red heifer, I've always asked myself why red. And of course, we're not told. It's always reminded me of Edom. It's reminded me of Esau. And in light of everything you said, it's like this whole parsha, we could talk about contradictions or even opposites, because Esau and Edom represented one side of human potential, the negative side. And as you were pointing out, say with death, and I understand this personally, how you can get caught into that lack of faith, all that questioning, which is really, and can bring you to that side of Esau and that side of Edom in a way. And even so I sort of see that wrapped in there. And even when you get to the story of what happened with Moshe, it just seems to fit very well thematically with the red heifer when we talk about potentials or opposites, failure, success, things like that.
Okay, well, Yes, Edom, is, if you take it especially with Amalek, has to do with the question of doubt. Okay, on the other hand, you know, doubt can also be something which is very, very positive if it actually can, you know, get you to see maybe a larger picture. Questioning. Okay, there can be negative questioning, there can be positive questioning, where I don't just take things at face value. By the way, even Edom, right? So Esav is Edom, but on the other hand, King David is also an Admoni. Esav is a man of the sword. King David is a man of the sword. In one case, the sword is something which is an expression of power. In the other one, it's actually not seen as one of power, but ultimately one of, you know, removing the sources of power. So I'm just saying it's very interesting how I have the same thing, which can have opposite, you know, applications. And okay, I'll leave it at that. Everyone, it's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll see each other after the summer.